Almost everything you have heard about Operation Mockingbird is wrong. Not because the CIA never manipulated the news. It did. That part is documented, admitted, and sitting in the Congressional record. Wrong because the name itself is a problem, and once you understand why, you will understand something much more uncomfortable than the conspiracy theory. There's a real declassified CIA operation called Mockingbird. It is not the one people talk about. None of this comes from rumor. All of it comes from the government's own files. Let us start with what those files actually say. Case 1. The real Mockingbird. In 1973, the director of the CIA, James Schlesinger, ordered every employee in the agency to write down anything they knew about activities that might have fallen outside the CIA's legal charter. What came back was almost 700 pages. Internally, it was called the Family Jewels. It stayed secret for 34 years. In June 2007, under Freedom of Information Act pressure, the CIA released it. Inside that document, Item 3 of Attachment A is an operation called Project Mockingbird. Here is what it actually was. Between March 12th and June 15th, 1963, the CIA wiretapped the homes and offices of two Washington newspaper columnists. Their names were Robert S. Allen and Paul J. Scott. They wrote a syndicated column, and they had been publishing stories based on classified material. No warrant, no court, no judge. The connections were installed with the help of a telephone company official who was responding to a personal request from the CIA's Director of Security, Colonel Sheffield Edwards. And Edwards' authority for the activity was the Director of Central Intelligence himself, John McCone. McCone then conducted the activity in coordination with the Attorney General of the United States, Robert Kennedy, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, and the Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, General Joseph Carroll. Look at that list of names. That is not a rogue operation buried in a basement. That is the top of the American national security state, agreeing together to listen to two reporters' phones. And it worked. The internal assessment describes the intercepts as particularly productive. The wiretaps identified the columnists' confidential sources, and the memo counts them. 13 newsmen, 12 senators, 6 members of Congress, 21 congressional staff members, 16 government employees, including a member of the White House staff, people in the Vice President's office, and an assistant attorney general. That is who was talking to two reporters, and the CIA now had a list. And the memo names exactly who else knew: the Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, the Inspector General, the General Counsel, 3 men on the record aware. That is the real Project Mockingbird. 90 days, 2 journalists, signed off at the highest level of the United States government. And it is almost never what people mean when they say the word. Case 2, where the other name came from. The version most people know goes like this. A vast CIA program called Operation Mockingbird recruited hundreds of American journalists to plant stories and shape what the public believed. Here is the part that gets left out. That name does not appear in any declassified CIA document, not in the Family Jewels, not in the Church Committee's report, not anywhere in the record. It comes from a book. In 1979, author Deborah Davis published a biography of Washington Post publisher Katharine Graham. In it, Davis used the term Operation Mockingbird to describe what she argued was a coordinated CIA media influence effort. The name stuck. It spread. It became the shorthand for the whole subject. No memo confirms this next part, but it is worth noticing. When Davis published that name in 1979, the real Project Mockingbird was still classified. It stayed classified for another 28 years. There are 3 possibilities. She invented the name and landed on the same one by coincidence. She heard it from someone who knew, or someone gave it to her on purpose. Nobody has ever settled which. Now, this is the moment where a lot of channels would tell you the story is therefore fake and move on. That is not what the record says. Because while the name was invented, the underlying conduct was investigated, confirmed, and published by the United States Senate. Case 3. The Church Committee. In December 1974, New York Times reporter Seymour Hersh published a front-page story alleging the CIA had spied on American anti-war activists for years in violation of its own charter. Congress responded. On January 27, 1975, the Senate created a select committee to investigate the intelligence agencies. Its chairman was Senator Frank Church of Idaho. Everyone calls it the Church Committee. The scale of what it did is worth stating plainly. 126 full committee meetings, then the subcommittees, 40 more hearings, roughly 800 witnesses, and beneath all of it, 110,000 documents reviewed. Its final report was published on April 29, 1976. 6 volumes, 2,702 pages. Its conclusion, in the committee's own words, intelligence agencies have undermined the constitutional rights of citizens, primarily because checks and balances designed to assure accountability have not been applied. That was the general finding. On the subject of the press specifically, the committee found this: the CIA had maintained secret, official relationships with approximately 50 American journalists. Not rumored, not alleged, found by a Senate committee with the agency's own files in front of it. The committee also confirmed the broader machinery. The CIA had funded books. It had built front organizations. It had placed stories in foreign media to shape what audiences overseas believed. The man most associated with building that system was Frank Wisner, who ran the CIA's Office of Policy Coordination in the early Cold War. Wisner reportedly described his network with a phrase that has outlived him. He called it the mighty Wurlitzer. A Wurlitzer is an organ, one player, many pipes, one coordinated sound. The audience hears music. It does not see the keyboard. Case 4. The number the public never got. Here is where it gets genuinely strange. The CIA did not hand the Church Committee everything. It handed over roughly 400 summaries describing its relationships with journalists. Summaries, not files. The agency refused to provide the full files. It refused to name the individual journalists. It refused to name the news organizations they worked for. In late March 1976, that standoff produced an extraordinary dinner meeting at CIA headquarters. Present were Senator Church, the committee's vice chairman, Senator John Tower, senior committee staff, and the director of the CIA at the time, George H.W. Bush. At that dinner, the agency held its position. No full files, no names. And the committee's published finding, the number that reached the American public, was about 50. The number of summaries the agency had actually produced was about 400. Both numbers are real. They describe different things, and the gap between them is the entire argument that followed. Case 5. Bernstein. On October 20th, 1977, Rolling Stone published an article by Carl Bernstein. Bernstein was one of the 2 Washington Post reporters who broke Watergate. Nobody could dismiss him as a crank. The article was called "The CIA and the Media." He spent 6 months on it, interviewing former officials. His conclusion was that more than 400 American journalists had secretly carried out assignments for the CIA over the previous 25 years. He named names, including Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times, columnist Stuart Alsop, Time magazine. And Bernstein made a second accusation, aimed not at the CIA but at Congress. He argued the Church Committee had covered it up, that when the agency dangled the dramatic material, the assassination plots, and the exotic weapons, the committee took it and let the media question go. That is a journalist accusing the investigation itself of going soft. Now be careful here. Bernstein's 400 figure is his reporting, not a Senate finding. The Church Committee's confirmed number is around 50. Those are not the same tier of evidence, and anyone who tells you they are is selling you something. But notice, What is not in dispute by anyone? The CIA had secret relationships with American journalists. The agency admitted it. The Senate confirmed it. The only argument was about how many and how far it went. What actually changed? The reforms were real. In 1976, CIA Director George H.W. Bush announced the agency would stop using American clergy in intelligence operations. On November 30, 1977, his successor, Stansfield Turner, issued formal guidelines prohibiting the CIA from recruiting journalists as paid assets or using American news organizations as cover. That same era produced the permanent Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in 1976, the House Intelligence Committee in 1977, and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act in 1978, which for the first time required a court to approve intelligence surveillance of American citizens. That is a serious response. It is fair to say the system corrected itself. But read the 1977 regulation closely, because the exception is in the text. Section 3. One sentence. No exceptions to the policies and prohibitions stated above may be made, except with the specific approval of the Director of Central Intelligence. One sentence undoes the whole page. The ban on the CIA using journalists could be waived by the Director of the CIA. And the regulation only barred paid accredited relationships. In its own words, the agency would continue to permit unpaid relationships with journalists who voluntarily maintained contact. A rule that its own author can waive, written by the same institution it governs, is not the same thing as a prohibition. So where does that leave you? Here's the honest picture, with nothing added and nothing removed. A CIA operation called Mockingbird is real. It wiretapped 2 American reporters in 1963, authorized by the CIA director and coordinated with the Attorney General and the Secretary of Defense. A separate, broader CIA effort to influence the news is also real. It was investigated by the United States Senate, confirmed in a 2,702-page report, and resulted in formal policy changes and new federal law. The specific phrase, Operation Mockingbird, describing that broader effort, was coined by an author in 1979 and appears in no government document. All 3 of those statements are true at the same time. And this is the part worth sitting with. The easiest way to make people stop asking about a documented Senate finding is to attach a name to it that cannot be verified. Then the argument becomes about the name, not about the 50 journalists, not about the 400 summaries the agency would not open, not about the dinner where the CIA said no to the United States Senate and won. Just the name. Mockingbird. Conspiracy theory. Case closed. You have probably seen the modern clips. Dozens of local news anchors, different cities, different stations, reading the same script, word for word. That footage is real. The documented explanation is corporate. Station owners handing one script to every newsroom they own. Is that the whole story? We do not know. The one time the government was forced to open its files on this question, it handed over summaries and kept the names. Could it happen today? Nothing ever required it to stop. The rule against it can be waived by the man it applies to. A mockingbird does not have its own song. It repeats what it hears around it, so convincingly that you assume you are hearing the original. Whether that is what happened to the American press, you can weigh for yourself. It was never supposed to be a question you could ask at all. The hearings happened, the report is public, the full files never were. Up next, on the Realize Files, we explore Roswell, not the legend, the declassified paper trail, exposing real lies, with real eyes.